This is Jeffrey Tucker, Brownstone Institute. In the 19th century, the economist Frédéric Bastiat made a very interesting observation, one I read very early, that has really stuck with me, and something we should all remember, which is that the state has no resources of its own. Everything it has, it gets from the private sector. Now, he's speaking from a classical liberal point of view, but regardless of your point of view, the observation is empirically correct. Now, the traditional way the state gets its revenue or its resources is through taxation. Another one is through inflation. Another one is through debt issuance. But there's yet another way the state can go about its business, which is to cooperate with the private sector in building its own power base. This is, I guess you would call, the mercantile matter, the mercantile model. But it's not just a historical model. The cooperation between the state and the private sector goes way back in history and has been a dominant form of the building of the hegemony for the better part of the 20th century. We saw it in the early part of the 20th century with the rise of the munitions industry, where the wars all over Europe were conducted on behalf of powerful industries supplying arms on all sides. This became a great scandal in American history once this came out after the end of the Great War. You can look at a book, for example, called The Merchants of Death. Like, how can you have the private sector, which is supposed to be beautifully productive and serving of humanity, suddenly you're providing the arms of munitions, of the bullets and the tanks and the guns and the gas that's killing people on both sides, profiting at the expense of humanity itself. But as time has gone on, as you look at the 21st century, you can see that this model of operation has pervasive throughout all of society, and it's becoming a genuine crisis for humanity itself. And I only need to point to the example of the COVID period as being a period of enormous industrial estate consolidation and collaboration. The very first article that came out that was hyping the idea of flattening the curve and social distancing was by Tomas Pueyo. This came out pretty early on. It popularized the idea with all sorts of fancy pants graphs and things, and it was on his Medium account, and it went mega viral, not organically, but because somebody behind the scenes is pulling the levers, because nobody had heard this guy. Suddenly he's the most famous theorist of epidemiology in the world. I don't think so. Nonetheless, his articles appeared in multiple languages and gotten millions of views online. Well, it turns out, who is this guy? Well, it turns out he's the CEO of an online learning platform, and his company rose massively in valuations throughout the pandemic period because, of course, people were using his technology. So he had a very strong interest in promoting lockdown ideology. Well, who else participated? The tech companies were right there to do all the censorship, which they did from the very beginning. Thrilled, I don't know about thrilled, but they were working very closely with government. The government that cannot get away with censorship without cooperation of the private sector. And who was responsible for dishing out the propaganda on a daily basis? Well, it was the media operations, our so-called independent press, but didn't prove itself not so independent after all. And then, of course, very crucially, you had the pharmaceutical companies, 4 or 5 of them, strongly involved from the very beginning, even for the years prior, working with the World Health Organization, the CDC, NIH, Fauci, and all of his minions, with the biomedical industry and the deep state to manufacture an inoculation that was based on a new technology that was actually invasive of the very genetic code of our bodies. And we don't even know how much damage that did. and whether it's ever going to actually go away. So what you have in the COVID period is the ultimate sort of, it's like it was the Great War for when I say Great War, World War One is the analogy here. That was the sort of the end of the old world, the beginning of this new world of state consolidation with the munitions industry and the building of the warfare state. In the 21st century, the COVID period was a perfect illustration of what it's like to live under a sort of a new technocracy that invades our bodies and our minds at an unprecedented level. And this, I think, is, if not the central problem of our time, it's certainly one of the central problems of our time. And what's interesting, too, is you're seeing a lot of population resistance to this, not just a little, but massive. There's a huge movement to do something about the problem of the flocking cameras, the flocking cameras that are in your neighborhood taking pictures of your car and knowing where you had lunch, what time you picked up your kids from school, and so on. All this stuff is known by the data agencies that are now sharing all this data with governments. You cannot travel in this country without being surveilled. There are new technologies coming aboard right now that are creating glasses that will automatically do facial recognition for you as you look. Biometric information is being collected on us everywhere. You think you're going to save money by signing up for a reward system at your local gas station? No, this is all about marketing your data. So, we're dealing with a very serious issue, one that's a challenge, I think, to the left and right, because it's forcing us to kind of come to new understanding of a variety of issues. And I'm particularly devastated to discover all this stuff, or to observe all this stuff, because when the digital age dawned, I thought, great, another round of human progress. Here it comes. We're going to save so much time and be so much happier and have so much more resources now to cultivate our lives, cultivate learning, cultivate community. We look all around us, the very opposite has happened. It's very strange. I've written about this recently in an article for Epoch Times that I called it the Hedonic Treadmill. The more we adopt technologies to save us time, the less time we have. But these are all very interesting observations, and I want to introduce to you a partner that I've had in the whole COVID period to kind of work through these issues. We talk really almost daily about these problems and their implications for the future, and fighting against the rise of this technocratic, hedonic treadmill. And he has a new book coming out, and it's called Staying Human in a Soulless Age. And it's a brilliant work, and I'm pleased to announce it here on the show today. And we'll put up a cover of the book here on this podcast. I welcome you to the Brownstone Podcast, Tomas S. Harrington.
Jeffrey, very nice to be here. So much suggestive thought, so many suggestive thoughts in what you just said. I would start maybe by extending the timeline of this government economic collaboration that you were talking about. If we think about it, it really goes back to the beginning of the imperial age of Europe. It was the Portuguese crown that worked with wealthy stakeholders to go to India to finance the trips down the African coast, that went to India and then used their gunboats to say to the Indians, you're either going to trade with us or you're going to trade with nobody. Then we have the Spanish state, as the famous story of Columbus seeking first Portuguese sponsorship, not getting it, and then getting Spanish sponsorship, and setting up a system that in effect was state collaboration, again with nobles who were a sort of power center of finance, not a sort of, definitely a power center of finance, and the emergent bourgeois classes of both of those countries. So this idea of state collaboration is maybe older than we've wanted to see.
I guess you could even say that about the Medicis, right? I mean, we've got here finance and governments cooperating, even from the very early, yeah.
I mean, then there's the whole question of also Jewish banking during the Middle Ages as well. You had private entities that were often banking to the crown. And so there was always some sort of collaboration between capital holders and secular, if you want to call them that, secular power centers. So maybe it's not that new, and maybe, I don't mean to dig you here, but maybe it's some of the economic models that we have convinced ourselves in these recent years that work, such as the free market, that it exists, that it had ever existed. Maybe that's part of the blindness and our surprise at this point.
Well, the blindness comes down to the binary, right? I mean, right. And I'm as guilty of that as anybody. My mentor, Murray Rothbard, very early on in his career, wrote a brilliant book called Power and Market, and it elucidates so many things, but it set up this kind of dichotomy, between the market on one hand and the state on the other. Okay, that looks beautiful on a chalkboard, and exactly. Conceptually, that's very interesting to look at. But if you look at his career and the way it unfolded, within 5 years of having written that book, he was scrambling all the pieces of the chessboard again, because he began to observe that the cooperation of the private sector and the public sector in the building of the war in Vietnam, and so the rest of his career was spent sort of examining all the ways in which the original constructs that he built are not adhered to in real world political economy.
That's called an intellectually honest man.
Yeah. And
I think that gets to one of the great problems of our time, is our institutions want us to slot into a certain area, especially in academia. You say something in your doctoral thesis and you basically are asked or rewarded for saying variations on the same thing for the next 30 years. And in fact, I had when I was a young assistant professor, at my first tenure track job, I later went on to another place. He cornered me in the faculty lounge and he said, Tom, what you've got to do is get your subject and then just pick apart all the little things in it so you can create a level of publication that will make you really look good at tenure time. And I thought to myself, this guy was basically telling me to be turned into a academic recycling idiot and to not go exploring beyond the parameters of what I'd already done, and everything would work out fine. And sad as that may sound, that goes on in a lot of places. The other thing is the simplifying tendencies of the human mind. There's a piece in the book I talk about academic models and modeling in general, how they really flatten out reality. And they give us a crutch to deal with the complexity of reality in various moments of our lives, but they really don't do the job oftentimes of describing the reality very well. And we get caught between our desire to have a feeling that we have control of a given subject and the desire to actually describe it and discover it and explore it in all its richness and complexity. Because that would mean having to change your mind. And that would mean having to say you were wrong. And that would mean a whole bunch of things. So a lot of times the simplification process kicks in and people don't look back. And it only frightens me more that AI is going to put that simplification process into overdrive. Because people aren't even reading the original text now. So what they're going to be having is a simplification of a simplification of a simplification of a simplification. And the nuance will be further lost in all of this, which
at least it's 95% accurate.
By a fact-checking organization?
Well, the problem is you don't know where the 5% of error is.
And according to whom? By what criterion?
Yeah. I was thinking on your observation I know you want to observe a lot of things, but on your observation about the silos within academia, I'm fascinated by this because you notice during the COVID thing, suddenly the epidemiologists were trotted out. It's like, okay, now it's your time in the sun. Time for the epidemiologist. Well, pandemic ends. Epidemiologists go away, or whatever. And before the epidemiologists, it was the climatologists. Here they come. Here they come. Here come the climatologists. Now it's time for them to go away because we need AI data centers. And if there's an economic crisis, here will come in the economists, and they'll be shuffled off again. So.
Well, this is the problem. You and I have talked about this in the past. I think one of the problems is what has happened to humanistic education. Yeah. In scientific education, which became important at the end of the 19th century, the idea was to engage in analysis. Nothing wrong with analysis, but analysis means breaking things down into their constituent parts. And the German university broke things down into departments and in the constituent parts of reality. And we adopted that model through Johns Hopkins University primarily, and then others after that in the late 19th century. And that's great. You can go deeply into a certain area. But cultures do not work that way. Cultures are, by definition, interdisciplinary and constantly in motion. Yeah. And so when you set up institutions that freeze culture, freeze the society, carve it up, and give rewards for ever smaller pieces of those precincts being divided up, who's going to put Humpty Dumpty back together again when you have a crisis that calls on integrated thinking? And I'm to the point of, I think I've written as much. I think our universities, which started under the premise of Renaissance humanism and that integrated view of looking at the world and man within it, have come to the end of their usefulness in many ways because they cannot address in a holistic way anything in any way useful fashion. And it has created a great anxiety in thinking people to say, well, I don't know all about that. Well, you don't need to know everything about everything. What you need to do is engage in another mental process, which is synthesis. Take what you know about various areas, trust your intuition and your capabilities of discernment, and put it together. And try and trace out what you think is going on a large scale canvas.
But that requires what you just said, discernment, which requires time. It requires vast reading, understanding, integration, thoughtfulness, sort of constant exercise of the human mind, which has to be trained like a great athlete in order to be able to do this. But all the learning tools of our time are not, especially AI. I mean, is that still happening anymore? I'm not sure.
I'd add one thing to the list of qualities that you just listed, intuition. And of course, intuition's a fascinating thing. The modern mind wants us to believe that intuition doesn't exist because we can't nail it down. It's like things like love and all sorts of inchoate things, but that we know are real. But intuition, I've found, is very important in thinking, writing, and even teaching. That you exist and you play with, you develop a quality through your intellectual explorations that allows you to make educated guesses about reality. And if we go back to the pandemic, what were they telling us always? Don't make any guesses. Don't rely on your intuition. Don't rely on your own sense of discernment. You're not an expert. And of course, the experts, when they're allied with power, can do the work of what power wants. And so they want us to be disempowered, and they want us to take away intuition and discernment, which are two of the greatest gifts that a human being can have. I'm sure you've met people who you say, well, he's unschooled or she's unschooled, but have enormous insight into the human condition because they've spent their whole life necessarily looking and integrating and looking at patterns in life. Mm-hmm. And they're very wise and they're very highly intelligent in many cases. I don't know if you saw it last night. Tucker Carlson, you mentioned the flock cameras. He had a wonderful monologue, and he had a young policeman from Pawtucket, Rhode Island, who was on
Pawtucket, okay.
Or as they say in Rhode Island, Pawtucket. from he was from Pawtucket, and he was a policeman who spoke up about the flock cameras. And it's obvious that this guy he probably hasn't gone to great schools or anything. Highly intelligent, highly articulate, based in a way, morally based and intellectually based in a very profound way. Well, how does a person become that way if the only source of knowledge is some smart person standing in front of us and telling us what to think? And we've abandoned ourselves to this idea that what they sometimes call in academia the sage on the stage, that the sage on the stage is all you have to do. You have to copy his notes and feed them back to him, and that's called being educated. And it's a terribly destructive tendency.
Well, one wonders about the whole academic path as a career path, and what it does to the soul. I'm just not sure about it anymore. Really, when I look at friends of mine who are sort of these days, I would say, stuck in academia. I mean, it's depressing because if you went into it, expecting dialogue and diversity of thought and colleagues with whom to exchange ideas and test new things and learn from and get references and everything, what you encounter is a petty world ruled by HR and students who you can't really have very high standards for them because they're paying customers. Exactly. And I have to laugh all the time because academia these days panicked about AI. Well, the students are using AI. What are we going to do? There's nothing we can do. What do you mean? There's nothing we can do? I mean, there are credentialing organizations all over the world that every day have learned to test what people know as a way of letting them jump through professional hoops, and they know it. What you have to do is you have to give the students material and make sure that they master it with very difficult exams and pass half of them. And exams are very carefully proctored. It works. But if you did that in colleges, they would empty out, right? And they can't afford that.
There was an incident at Brown that had just occurred. A professor of, I think it's game theory, had a bunch of students. He gave a take-home exam. Now, I'm out of academia 3 or 4 years now. And in this environment, I would never give a take-home exam. What a silly thing to do in the first place. But then he caught the students copying from each other. They had all sorts of similar answers that were generated by AI. And the grades were off the charts. And he reported it to the committee at Brown that looks at these things. And they said, well, we want to have a non-punitive approach to this. So what is the message that's being sent? And as you say, there are many ways we could deal with this. For example, the Italian educational system, unbeknownst to a lot of people, the Italian liceo system, high school system, is very rigorous compared to a lot of countries and produces some excellent results. And if I'm not, I think I'm understanding it well, they've always depended on oral exams.
Yeah,
but how do you fake it? How do you fake an oral exam? Either you would master it or you don't master it. And maybe we need to go back to oral exams.
Yeah, but the point is we know how to teach, we know how to test, we know how to credential, but the point is that the universities are so blown up and so out of control, as just an industrial force, that you can't prioritize that, or else they would all be depleted of revenue.
One proviso on testing, though, is testing's also part of the problem. The idea that you are in school to be tested is also a problem. So you need to have tests, but you need to create a culture where it's clear that the test is an afterthought to the process of learning. Yeah. And how do you do that? That's where culture building comes in, and it clashes with what the American university has become. It's a place where you go to have sex, drink, meet people who you think will be your contacts in business later on, and have a good time. And all of them are spending enormous amounts of money on the health centers and the football fields, which, nice when it was an adjunct in the early 20th century. But I've had students that used to say to me, "Hey, professor, I've got a workout. I won't be coming to class." And I'd look at them and I'd say, "Wait, you came to college for what purpose?" But they felt perfect. They would never say they don't say to their coach, "Hey, I've got class. I won't be at the workout." They say to me, "I've got a workout. I won't be going to class." And that tells you an awful lot about the ethos of running the college. But there's the other problem that you've hit on. These are paying customers. And these colleges are, many of them, very close to the bone in terms of keeping their revenues coming in. And they don't want to offend the paying customer.
It's one of the strangest features of economics of universities that reflects a peculiar feature of nonprofits, which I know well because I run one. But they have to have, so many of these universities have gigantic endowments. And so you're looking at it superficially from the outside and say, well, why is your tuition so high? Why are you constantly scrambling for donations from alumni? How come students are having to go into debt $100,000, $200,000, $300,000 a year to be able to afford when you're sitting on multiple billions, tens of billions, sometimes hundreds of billions in revenue? But if you look at the formulas they're up against, they lose their nonprofit status if they don't have at least a third of their revenue from on an annual basis being provided by new donations, new contributions, new revenue streams. Is that
true? I didn't know that.
Yeah, and because if the dividends, earnings, and valuations of their stock portfolio overwhelm more than 1/3 over a period of 5 years, they lose their nonprofit status and they have to become foundations. So that explains the whole thing.
Wow, that's a big insight for me. I didn't know that. Yeah. I always heard it termed, a friend of mine who's in college guidance, college guidance, in other words, helping to get kids into college from a very prestigious secondary school. He calls it the arms race. And he likens it to the silliness of the arms race, that these colleges having the big endowment becomes in and of itself the goal of a lot of people. Sure. at the top of the pyramid. And they just are obsessively going after that because that's the type of animals they are, and that's what the game is. Which gets to another subject which really interests me, is the imposition of games upon reality. And it gets back to the whole problem of paradigms or epistemologies that we lay upon reality. I think one of the fascinating things elements of our time is how we have given ourselves over to the idea of living without questioning within the paradigms that society sets up for us to live in. And I think, in other words, there's reality, and then there's the paradigm or epistemology we lay over it to make sense of it, what we were talking about earlier, in a certain sense. Most people seem very content not to question or even explore the fact that they're living within an epistemology, and that epistemology, while convenient in helping them explain the world, might be cutting them off from a whole bunch of other things out there in reality. And I think a lot of this has to do, and I'm just throwing something out there, about the lack of practice toward transcendence in our society. I think when we were more religious societies, had a belief that there's reality, but then there's something beyond reality that's lurking, and that our job is to see beyond the fog to find out what that is or might be. When you stop having that as a mindset, and probably through the cessation of religious practice, then people live quite close to the paradigm, and they don't even begin to question what might be behind it. And I think it's hurting us terribly as a culture. And I think it's lending to this idea that we're at the point of diminishing returns within the paradigm of modernity that has been predominant in our Western culture for 500 years.
And that gets to the title of your book, Staying Human. And your book covers so many topics, the very idea of progress itself. But talk to me about what you just said about this idea of diminishing returns. In a conversation last night, you used a word I'd not heard before, which was that you said something like, the technological revolution is, I forget now the word you used, but it was like turning in on itself. I remember your hand motion.
The involution.
Involution.
I hope that's a word. I think it is.
It's like the opposite of evolution.
Evolution. It's
involution.
Beginning.
It's not evolution. It's more like that classic image of the snake eating its tail, right?
Exactly. I think for some time now, and we talked a little bit, and the question is, at what point in history did the paradigm of modernity turn inward on itself and become turn in on itself and not even allow us to have the illusion of progress, if you want to call it that, or progress itself, that is the hallmark of modernity. So modernity starts with the idea or presumes the idea of linear progress. But it presumes that everything new is always better. But at a certain point, that search for newness on the presumption that we're going to get things better might begin cannibalizing things that work perfectly well in the name of generating or keeping this idea of progress alive in the culture. And I think there are many instances where we could look around us quite easily and see what I'm talking about. I mean, simply getting on a plane, buying a plane ticket, what you have to do to check in on a plane when you used to just go up and say, "Hi, here's my ID. I want to get on this plane." You have it in your system. Thanks. Give me the ticket. On we go. But now there's all these pre-checks where they're stealing your information. They're running it through all sorts of security information and so on and so forth. But that's not even the best. There was a marvelous article by Michael Lind in Unheard yesterday.
That was a great article.
It's a great article.
I couldn't stop reading it. It was absolutely brilliant. It talked about the healthcare system initially, but that's an analogy to the whole world now.
Yeah. We're being run through paces that we run through on the presumption that someone in authority has decided that this will make my life better. And we have become so insouciant before the fact, or so presumptuous of the fact that everything new will make it better, that like sheep, we go along with it instead of saying, "Hey, that's not making my life better." Speaking to the pennies a day Philippine person who's trying to handle my phone call. No offense to the Philippine person who's been put in that position. Trying to get something fixed with a multinational does not make my life better. Nor does I used to be able to call people up, have a real human being, have a real thinking person who could resolve a problem for me. But no, we get shuffled through all these places. And it makes you begin to believe, and I believe, that really the best way to look at a lot of these things is the medieval manor, where in fact capital has now put itself inside the manor walls. We serfs live on the outside of the manor walls. We have problems in our life, and under the original contract with the noble was supposed to provide for us in a paternal way. Well, the noble doesn't provide for us. In fact, when you have a problem, the noble closes up the gates of the manor and says, "You're on your own. But I've got your money. Oh, and I can still call on you when wartime comes for you to be my soldier when I'm fighting against another noble." And I think in many ways, this is where we're going. And I think a lot of these processes that we assume, or in a sort of, I think insouciance is a great word, in a sort of heedless fashion, we say, sure, that's great, it's better. We don't ever ask, is it better? And if it's not better, why am I doing it? And if I'm doing it, is it inevitable? And of course, that gets to the whole idea of, TINA, there is no alternative. And what a lot of culture planners do in these days are trying to, or what it's about is trying to convince us that we have no alternatives. And I think it's frightening to see how many people have acceded to the fact that they have no power, they have no agency. back to that Tucker Carlson interview last night. He had this wonderful policeman who bucked the system and said, I don't want to be part of a flock camera system as I do my work as a patrolman. And one of the things he said is he went around to people that loved him. They said, well, you're going to get hammered for this. And he said something very interesting. He said, isn't it kind of sad in America that when you have a moral problem like this, all of the people that love you tell you don't do it because speaking up will get you hammered in America? And to me, that was a killer line. In other words, they've convinced a strong plurality of our fellow citizens, I think, that the very idea of speaking up is more hassle than you could ever want. And so the best thing to do is to keep your mouth shut and let the new impositions flow over you and hope that you can find some humanity in the deluge.
This what you just said is, I mean, that's the best description of everything I've seen since 2020. Everybody, so it's the problem with academia, for example. It's like, why would you speak? Are you out of your mind?
Yeah.
You got this job. You got a tenure track job. You did all the right things to get your promotion to associate professor. Then you became full professor and you have tenure. Why would you throw all that away? Right. Just for saying something that that may be true, whatever. But to what end? You're going to ruin your life. And that's what everybody was told during the whole COVID period. I remember Martin Kulldorff, sort of a brilliant scholar, but kind of has this habit of saying what he thinks, right? And which it turns out to not be a good thing in academia. But he told me very early on in the COVID period that he said, it's not true that epidemiologists are going along with this. He said, in fact, I don't know a single one. You talk to anybody in public health today, and they will all tell you private that this is bananas, that it's not going to solve the pandemic. It's going to make everything worse. It's going to bring ill health and nonstop social destruction. He said, so I don't understand this line that the science is settled. It makes no sense to me. But the difference between Martin and everybody else is that Martin had to speak out,
So that raises a question, and a very important one, I think. What is it in our culture that has created an almost wall-to-wall, go-along, get-along attitude in everything? And
by the way, I have to stop you. Did you know that existed before the COVID period? Did you know that everybody was just playing about, that they allowed themselves to be gamified?
I had intuitions of it for a long time in academia, because what happens in academia is you go through this long apprenticeship. You're a child in your institutional power into your 30s. And, then if you go for tenure and get tenure, and then you have the chit of associate professor, then full professor. So you're constantly thinking in terms of pleasing an inchoate idea of power out there that has control of your life. And so when you finally become with tenure or a full professor, most people have had it beaten out of them. And so then it begs the question of what have we been allowing, or what is it we're lacking that has made us so compliant? I mean, I could give you a short-term answer, which would be, I believe that from September 11th onward, there was a concerted program to induce fear and compliance in the society, and to condition us like Pavlovian dogs to the idea that security is the highest value in life, because what we're really talking about is job security too. Security is the highest human value, and all that can be done from authority in the name of security is licit. Well, some of us were screaming about it in 2001. Most of us weren't. Most people just said, well, That's what they need to do to keep us safe. That's what they need to keep us safe. Well, you live under that. You live in that mentality. You become a serf. You become a modern version of a serf because you're basic. That was the deal in serfdom. I give you the safety of my castle when the marauders come, and you can come inside the gates. But in turn, you give me a part of your crops. You give me your fealty. And if we can believe the idea of droit de seigneur, you allow me to have sex with your daughter when I need to. And then you, in turn, have to also fight wars for me when I have a problem with the baron in the next land. How different is that from what we've done increasingly over these last 20 years in terms of giving away our rights as citizens in the name of supposedly gaining security, which of course we haven't gained at all.
And it's not, well, when you say security, the broadest conception of that word would also pertain to social position, right? So you want financial security, but you also want position in your ascendant social position in life.
Absolutely.
You climbed up, so you don't want to risk either of those things. So you don't want to risk your financial position, you don't want to risk your social status, and in turn your professional status. And those who do speak out and are willing to risk those things, they have to make examples of them.
Exactly.
I mean, what happened to Martin was very interesting because, of course, he was a full professor at Harvard, tenured. So how do you get rid of a tenured full professor at Harvard? Well, you have to create some compliance issue, and as a sort of a dare.
Yes.
And in that case, it was the shop mandate. I mean, now clearly, Martin, as an epidemiologist and a public health guy, knew that because he got a very bad case of COVID, that he had natural immunities. He wasn't going to get shot. That's just ridiculous. He was not going to betray his principles. So he was ultimately shoved out of Harvard on a technicality, namely his noncompliance with the taking of the product.
Yeah. Well, there's another question that comes up. Why is the anxiety of security so great when in theory we're in the most abundant time, the most abundant period of material health in the world's history?
Why?
So this is a huge paradox that I don't think we spend enough time thinking about.
Yeah.
And a number of ideas come to mind. One is that modernity and modern capitalism focus on the individual, and they tend to be very corrosive to community. Okay. And in fact, there's very compelling studies that you look at what land enclosure was in England. It destroyed communities, right? And it made a person who lived on the lands, on the nobles' lands, in a more benign form of living. Not necessarily, if you had a good noble, great. And they had communal lands. Each person had their little piece. And if they had a failure in their field, well, they could make a deal with the person in the next strip in the noble's land. Okay. It's not wealth, but you have a community there that won't let anyone starve who's part of that community. But capitalism puts an emphasis on the individual, which has its beautiful things that we love and admire, right? Individual initiative. But it does undermine communal life. And if you had communal life, you would have more backups against the machine when the machine comes and tries to obliterate you. But now we're in a situation, we've given our communities away to the machine. And so the machine can zero in on any person at this point. And unless that person has family wealth, which is very rare, that person can be crushed in a sort of pincer movement by any number of tricks that the powerful people wanting absolute social discipline can impose upon that person. And that may be one of the reasons why we cling so terribly much to our quote unquote security, which in the end isn't terribly secure at all, because as a whole generation of people since the 80s know, you can be laid off at any time by the machine.
Yeah. Yeah. By the way, your comments remind me of a sociologist by the name of Robert Nisbet, who I need to revisit. So maybe that's something you and I could do together. Maybe do a quick read of one of his.
I don't know him. I've been reading two people lately. In fact, they're quite complementary. One is Wendell Berry, a poet, philosopher, farmer. And kind of a disciple of his, Paul Kingsnorth, who's a British writer.
What's his Kingsnorth's recent book?
It's called Against the Machine.
So I've read that. And although that book is so dark that you have to read it, just in pieces because it's.
Yeah,
I didn't realize he was a student of Wendell Berry. I have to tell you, Tom, just in passing, I didn't. You mentioned Wendell Berry last night. I didn't tell you this because it's sometimes embarrassing. But I used to have nothing but disdain for Wendell Berry. I remember just making fun of the guy, and now here I am. I wrote a whole book on a very similar figure recently. The Spirits of America book. So I don't know, Wendell Berry, very interesting. I probably need to revisit him too.
Well, one of the things that they both talk about, and it gives me a lot of pause as a person who has been fortunate to travel. I jokingly call myself the traveling homebody because I love to travel, and yet I'm a homebody who loves going back to places of his childhood and where his ancestors came from. And I always felt a little old fogey-ish having this. I've had it since I was a young kid. I always loved history and the history of people that I loved. And what both Berry and Kingsnorth say is that place is a very primal part of us. This idea of mobility that is such a part, again, of modern capitalism. Go where the money is, go where the job is. We never talk about what gets sacrificed in that effort to go where the money is and go where the job is. And then we turn around and say, I feel rather unrooted. I feel like I don't have real good friends. I feel like I'm an alien floating along in a society that doesn't care for me. And we all know that small societies can be encroaching, but so can they be very nurturing of who we are. And I've always thought of some way that you can work out having a relationship that nurtures you, but doesn't entrap you. And that's the game one tries to play. But I'm very suspicious of people who won't tell you about where they're from. I remember having a conversation with a guy here in Hartford who sees himself as a kind of a shaker mover in the nonprofit area. And he happens to be from the home of my mother and my grandmother and grandfather in a old mill town that's in northern Massachusetts. And I spent a lot of time, and I'm very identified with the place for a lot of reasons. And I wanted to talk to him. I said, well, you're from there. Did you know this? Do you know that? He didn't want to talk about anything about where he was from. And he turned the conversation to how he had spent many years in New York and what he had done in New York. And this idea that once you get into the jet stream of higher education and high society in America, you're supposed to look back with a sort of condescending disdain on the little town where you came from and the human beings in it. And I've always been suspicious of people who do that. I've obviously traveled, but I've never felt disdain from where I come from. And I think the system, in a certain way, asks for you to become part of the club, that you have to disdain the smaller places that are outside the metropole. And you hear this when you listen to NPR or read the New York Times, who all sound the same, by the way, the same sort of class-based voices. You even see it in the way the reportage begins oftentimes, with a sort of quaint vignette about the primitive place where they're visiting. and the American flags are flying as you go down Main Street. And then they zero in. It's almost a formulaic thing. And the idea is, look at me, sophisticate, going down to the boonies and talking with the natives.
Yeah, that's true. It's true. Yeah, it is a formula, and it's annoying. Here I am on Mars visiting these strange alien peoples.
But the bigger thing is, what is it about upward mobility, American style, and maybe world style, who knows, that makes you have to go into the realm of the placeless and go into the realm of the rootless cosmopolitan and have more in common with the person in another country of your same social class than you do with a person in your own city of a different social class.
I'm thinking about it. Partially what you're describing involves tearing us away from our roots, which involves tearing children away from their parents in part, right?
Yes.
And it's fascinating when you look at the sweep of history, because after World War II, there was initially this sort of valorization of what was called the nuclear family, right? Which was, a kind of a war on the traditional intergenerational model of homesteading, where you had several generations living on top of each other. So no, that's bad. Now we have to crush it down to just a single family, mom, dad, and the kids, and here's your house, your garage, and your cars, and so that's the very essence of happy life, and the government will take care of grandma, thanks to the new programs. But now here we are. Fast forward 75 years now. That's being broken down.
Well, and we can now kill grandma. Never mind having to have her in the rest home or in your home. You can, she's too much trouble, and in Canada you can depress her and ask her to have her asked to get killed.
And that's coming here too. Yeah, that's definitely coming here. Yeah, because got to save resources, as you know. Well, give us a look ahead at your book. What would you say are the main themes of your work, and what readers are going to get out of it?
I think part of it is an attempt to call to the question of what it means to be human, number one. I think I say in the introduction, I never thought about what it meant to be human. And now I have to ask myself what it means to be human. I thought that humanity was an ontological category that was solid and everlasting. And what these last few years have showed me, it's not the case. That we can be lowered by various factors in the society to the level of animals around us. So then the question is, what does it take to be human and to remain human? And what are the things that are being done to us that are making us feel inhuman or less than human and under siege? And so I divide the book up in various things. I think one of them is disorientation. I look at various ways that what the people I call the culture planners, the elites who configure our set of options, life options through their power, and what we see, what we read, and what's available in the marketplace, are engaging in a game of disorientation with us. And they want us to be confused. They want us to feel uprooted from our past. They want children who can't understand the concatenation of relations that have brought them to this point. They don't want anyone thinking outside the presentist model. And of course, a person that thinks only in terms of the present is a non-reflective person, and much easier to sway and to channel into things that you want them to do. Another part of it looks at, and I think it's very important to talk in these frank terms, the disdain that is meted out to us. That a lot of things that we feel bad about are designed to make us feel bad. There's a piece where I talk about Biden, and it was written at the end of the Biden administration. And I start off by saying, well, wasn't there anyone better than Joe Biden that the elites could find someone less of a corpse that they could have put up before us. And then I begin to think, well, maybe that was exactly the point. If I can elect a corpse, I can make you feel completely powerless and that your political systems mean nothing. And if we can do this again and again and again through the manipulation we have of the machine, we will become completely depressed about our possibilities and begin to internalize the idea that there is no alternative. And I think if we're careful, and I think this runs up against a certain innate American optimism, that we don't want to say things openly and strongly like this, but there are obvious attempts to humiliate us in our society time and time again. You need go no further than COVID itself, and basically saying to people, hey, take an experimental drug or I'll ruin your life. That's planned humiliation. And we see planned humiliation all around us. Then I begin to look at some of the historical, well, in some of the issues of what I call insouciance, as I've mentioned to you, how we have become numb in many ways to the things we need to be careful about. I'm a big believer in attention. One of the pieces in the book it's the first piece in the book, about how my father used to quote George Santayana to me and say, everything is eternal. The only thing that is not is our attention. And it's the idea that being attentive as a human being is what makes you human. And we live in an age of distraction that is designed to not allow us to be attentive. But it's only by being truly attentive to what's here, what's now, and to the miracle of it all that you can maintain your humanity. If you can't be attentive, you can't wake up in the morning, look at the sky, look at the trees, marvel at their presence. And then, of course, that sends you off to wondering about how you've got here. And you know you can't answer the question, but you know it fills you up with an enormous feeling of mystery, which at least makes you feel alive. At least for me, it does. But we're being told, no, close it down. Look at the screen. If you're going to be attentive, well, I'm going to break up that attention every 10 minutes. I'm going to make it for you to even attend enough to read a book.
And everything else is a waste of time.
Yeah.
Anything else you would dare do? Cut flowers, clean your windows, be attentive to your laundry services, or sit and contemplate looking at the lake, or going for a long walk. Yeah. That's all a waste of time. That's it. You don't have time for that stuff, man. You've got to get back to your digits and your technologies. In fact, you need more of them. Really, look at all the time you waste standing up to go turn on and off that light. You really should just be able to clap or say something to it. I mean, why?
I just, and I don't pretend to be immune to all of this either. I just spent a couple of weeks away from the house. I had my gadgets with me, but the whole point was to get away from the house and get to a beautiful lake nearby. And about 5 days in, I found myself looking compulsively at the screen, when in fact the whole point of being there was to get away from that for a while and not do it. And it once again reminded me of I'm part of that mentality, and I need to be attentive to what the compulsiveness that I was playing out at that moment. And I finally had, with a wonderful talk with my wife, I said, I'm not being attentive here. And I said, okay, I've got to be attentive in the way I was supposed to be at this place, in this way of getting away. One of the things I talk about, which I think gets misunderstood a lot, is the need to address mortality and tragedy in life. I think one of the byproducts of modernity with the idea of linear progress is that once you internalize it, you begin to ask the question, and the society begins to ask the question of you, of why can't I be eternal? Why can't I be immortal? Why can't I live forever? Why do I have to become decrepit and die? And you can see this in our culture by the way we warehouse old people. We don't use them as a resource. We send them off, as you were suggesting earlier, because their decrepitude reminds us of the fact that that's what awaits us all. And I've been very influenced in my life by a Spanish philosopher named Miguel de Unamuno, who wrote a wonderful book called The Tragic Sense of Life. And he was at the cross section of where Spain was encountering modernity and going from a religious to a secular society. And he was saying, no, secularity brings with it pure desires that are material. We need to remind ourselves of our mortality, that life is tragic. And the idea is that once you face the idea of its finiteness and its tragedy, you begin to react differently to it and seize it and be attentive to it with an intensity that honors it, if you want to put it in those terms. And I think one of the things we saw in COVID is the planners of the operation knew this about us. They knew that they had a lot of people who had sublimated their fears about their own mortality in a society that will not allow expression of grief about death and kind of shoves it away. And so they knew that in each person there was a whole bunch of roiling, sublimated anxiety about death that people were not having a live dialogue with themselves about. And I would wager that if we still had live dialogues and rituals that are very important, funerals that are very important for us to remember where we're going, then I think the idea, our relationship with death would be out in the open as it was in many traditional societies, and we would not be so subject to people who can appeal to its sublimated existence within us. I don't know if that makes sense.
It's very powerful, very interesting. I've always puzzled about these questions. Really, the death rituals in particular. I mean, every society at all times and all places has had them, right?
Yeah.
They must serve some evolutionary purpose.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It brings to mind when I was a first-year teacher. I was teaching Antigone to a group of 8th graders. Imagine that. Today, teaching Antigone to a group of 8th graders or 7th graders. And of course, I love Antigone because it's all about honoring the father through the death ritual. And I can remember talking to the students and telling them what the death ritual of my grandfather was like and how I didn't understand it as a 9-year-old. All I could see was the tragedy. And going into the house of my grandmother and seeing people with drinks in their hands enjoying a party. And it disoriented me all the more. And then I realized that no, these rituals are there for us to celebrate the life that was, to celebrate being together in this moment and how important it was. But it took me years to do that. I brought this up, and you had this group of 7th or 8th graders. They couldn't stop talking about this subject. You know, when you're a teacher and you bring up something and you're throwing an idea out there. I had a group of 7th graders all wanting to share the stories of what death had meant in their families. It was almost like a dam had burst in them, and they wanted to talk about them. And that was really instructive to me. And Emmanuel Todd, who is a wonderful historian from France, has written a book on the decline of America that, interestingly enough, has not been translated into English. It's been translated in every other language, but The Decline of America by Emmanuel Todd, who predicted the fall of the Soviet Union, has not made it into English yet. I read it in Spanish. And he talks about the fact that cremation is replacing birth rituals as a key sign of cultural decadence.
Burial rituals.
Burial rituals.
Yeah.
And he points to that. Interestingly, he's a secular Jew, so it's not coming from someone who's coming necessarily from a Christian background. But he's saying that that's a sign of the final expiration of what he calls zombie Christianity among us, and that we are now becoming fully pagan in our way of looking at things. And I think the idea is based on the idea that seeing the body, addressing the dead body, is very important for people to process death and make it become meaningful in their own lives. And I think he's onto something. I just watched a wonderful podcast of a Spanish anthropologist who spent 30 years in the Amazon. And then he comes back to Catalonia, where he lives, and he says, the lack of rituals are destroying our societies. The lack of the rituals that help us locate ourselves in space and time and in relation to the other people in our lives are destroying us all. And they're being washed away by this sleepless material machine and the sleepless tablets in front of our eyes that don't give us a break and the time to contemplate these admittedly heavy issues that are really the roadway to becoming a contemplative and human, fully human member, fully human person.
You know, this issue of rituals it interests me because so many of them are, what's the word? It's like they're not conscious rituals. They're things that you go through, just a matter of living life in a sort of liturgical way, but that help you engage with others, give off the right social cues, know how to converse, how to be what we used to call a civilized person. And during the COVID period, we had these things that were called lockdowns, and we were told, stay home, stay alone, and don't socialize, don't do any of these things. It was like full scale shattering of the liturgy of life that we had just taken for granted. And now we are greeted with a completely new social ritual to wake up in this timeless void of nothing, rattle around trying to figure out what to do with ourselves, and then presumably enjoy watching, our stimulus payments increase our bank accounts, right? Which we're welcome to spend as much as we want on online systems that will bring you the product to your door. And this is but the thing, I don't know if you've had this sense, but I feel like that sort of, it wasn't just a brief period. It was an absolute break in social evolution and in the human personality itself. And I don't think we've recovered from it.
I don't think so. I think it was designed precisely. Again, think of that quote by Santayana: everything is eternal except our attention. Well, what are rituals but a way of calling attention to a serious matter? And rituals, what COVID, the planners of the operation, tried to do was basically put us into a timeless vortex without rituals. Even death was not allowed to be the moment of contemplation and reflection that it has always been in every society.
They got rid of funerals.
They got rid of funerals. They got rid of bedside mourning. I mean, this is one of the things.
Right.
This is one of the things that infuriates me to no end, that I don't think we've talked enough about. To be with someone you love who's dying is, however it affects you, one of the most powerful experiences you can ever have. And what they said was, no, we're not going to allow you to have that. We're not going to allow you to puncture your life of distraction to think about something really important and serious, the death of someone you love. And okay, he died, didn't see him, didn't feel him, didn't touch his warm hand or her warm hand, then go cold, didn't see the casket with the person in it, didn't go through the ritual of seeing my friends who came and loved that person onward and onward. So these things were taken away. And this is just one instance of the many rituals, social rituals.
That is absolutely dehumanizing, to use your word.
Yep, it's absolutely dehumanizing. Think what it is to deprive a 13-year-old child becoming something more than a child of the ability to freely experiment with their social skills and their sexuality through flirting, awkwardness, obsession, all the things that you remember when you first realized that you were completely taken up by the beauty of another person. Imagine taking that away and saying, here's the screen. Yep. Here's the screen, kid.
Freud says that this is the single most important stage of anyone's life, is this sort of bridge from childhood to adulthood, and it's exactly in that period that you're describing and struggling with that, precisely what you just mentioned, and we rob people of that. I mean, in Freudian terms, this would mean decivilizing people. I mean, his book is called
Civilization is Discontents.
Civilization is Discontents, and the discontents are the people who never really navigated through this difficult sort of transition.
Look around us, Jeffrey. Look at the blank faces of people who should be at the age of exuberance. Idiotic exuberance, healthy exuberance, all kinds of exuberance. I was all of those things. We robbed that. And not only do we rob that, we robbed them of, I'll speak in my case, the girl who sat two chairs in front of me and I couldn't get out of my mind in a given class. And we not only robbed them of that, but we knew they had porn at their disposition the same time as we were robbing them of the ability to act out the real thing in their primitive, hapless, probably unskilled way as it would. And so we gave them a scripted version, and we made sure they had that at their disposition that's what sex is. So we deprived them of all of the incremental stages, the awkward incremental stages, which are all part of the game. And we said, here's what it is. Well, this is what you got to do.
You know, you're speaking of Gen Z, of course. I think we have a name for this generation, and I think it's. I'm getting the growing sense that it's a broken, in many ways, shattered generation. I mean, not just from injury from repeated unnecessary inoculations from a gene-altering technology, but also from this sort of life of duplicitous surreptition that we forced them into for years. And you're right. You can see it in the eyes. You can see it in the lack of sincerity in communication, and even in vocabulary and in intonation. Instead of just plain declarative sentences, we have this inward, upward speak, and this sort of caution, and nothing's really meaningful. Nothing's really meant. You know, it's. As a kind of a wandering lostness that I detect in that generation.
I don't know if I speak for other young boys, but as one who's always been fascinated by words, I think of those years between 12 and 15, where all of this is going on inside you, as a time of intense linguistic experimenting. Swear words, how to use swear words, how to be clever, how to be cleverly insulting, how to engage in repartee of the insults as boys do as they grow older. These things that went on in my hockey locker room and that were all part of my training as an adult, how to be clever, and in those encounters you began to figure out who you were and what gifts you had and whether they were physical, mental, how you were going to establish yourself in this world. And we deprived them of that too. We
put masks on people for 2 years. Cover their faces so you can't see the lips moving of anybody else. And in fact, you don't even want to speak. I mean, who wants to speak with a mask on?
Yeah.
It's terrible. So
these were not innocent. These were not innocent measures. If you think I'm exaggerating, just do a thought experiment and say, let's assume for a moment that the medical issue was a farce, that it didn't have the import that they said it did. And in fact, we know this retrospectively, and some of us knew it in real time. Look at the measures taken and look at their effects on socialization and the cohesiveness of a culture. Every single one of them is a measure that in some way chips away at human development and the cohesiveness of a culture.
To be replaced by power.
By power. By power. Yeah. To be replaced by, to become citizens, to become subjects rather than citizens, to internalize the idea that the rights you thought you had were illusory and that we live in a fiat culture. And it goes back to that lovely policeman from Pawtucket, waking up and realizing that everyone now knows you don't stick your head above the parapet because it will get shot.
Yeah. You know, Tom, I don't know if you're feeling this or not, but I'm starting to sense it. I mean, just for the last few days that the revolt is on. I remember thinking during the commencement addresses this year when very consistently, and when any speaker would give the paradigmatic celebration of the newest thing, right? Look at you're going into a world of what? Of AI. The result was throughout the entire graduated class, boos and jeers to the point that the person couldn't speak anymore. This happened all over the country. And
I didn't pick up on that.
Yeah, this was very common. I remember thinking, what is going on here? This is very interesting. But now you have the resentment against the flock cameras. I mean, some police departments are even talking about getting rid of them, and the resistance to the data centers, many of whom are being built by using eminent domain. This basically rob people of their property, whether they want it or not.
Yeah.
And replace them with and invading whole communities with this infinite buzzing noise. You know, and for what purpose? To surveil people, to collect their data, to further dehumanize them. I mean, there's a growing resistance in the population, and we don't know. You know, it's good. The next few years are going to be very interesting because we don't know how far people are going to be pushed. It seems as if this might be something of a turning point. We'll see.
I happen to, I was going to say earlier, nihilism, you reach rock bottom with nihilism. And, you think of Chris Christopherson via Janis Joplin. Freedom is just another word for nothing left to lose. And I think what is happening, and I see in some of my children's and even younger, is the same, hey, I'm not going to have a house. I may not have a job. They're laying off people who in good paying jobs now. Hey, what is going to be? I don't know. I know it's horrible. I know I'm frightened, but once I have nothing, and there's a lot of people already who are feeling nothing, and I'm talking about ones that are relatively fortunate are saying this. Well, the ones who aren't relatively fortunate, what are they going to do? Lasers into flock cameras, it's maybe a natural outcome of all this.
It might be, or something else, but we don't know. We don't know where it's going to end up. But it is a fascinating. We seem to be coming to the end of something, or the beginning of something. We're just trying to figure out, what that is. I think your book is going to be a very, very interesting guide. I'm very proud that Brownstone's publishing it. I'm Proud of Brownstone's relationship with you and my personal relationship.
Likewise, Jeffrey.
You've been a great teacher for me, and a
likewise.
Difficult times, and
very difficult. Don't forget,
require personal relationships and interdisciplinary exchanges above all else. I think for people like us, anyway.
And I think for all human beings, dialogue. You know, I've said it to you before. The Brazilian, and I've written it too. The Brazilian poet talked about the art of the encounter. The art of the encounter between two or more people is where we learn, probably the most fundamental way to be human. We learn how to read emotions. We learn how to listen. We learn how to read people's faces, their bodies, the whole thing. And we need to keep encountering and making ourselves engage in dialogue. It humanizes us. It's a truly a humanizing, probably the most humanizing thing you can do.
Tomas S. Harrington, the book is Staying Human in a Soulless Age. It'll be out.
Soul shredding, I think, is the word we find. Soul
shredding age. That's even better. Yeah. And it'll be out in a few weeks, I think, if we can get to the final stages of it. Thank you, Tom, for visiting.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Okay.